Welcome, listeners, to today's episode of Future Secured, and we're joined by a very special guest, Rupert Taylor-Price, CEO of Vault Cloud, one of Australia's leading sovereign cloud providers. Rupert has spent the last decade pushing Australian digital sovereignty forward, advocating for local capability, secure cloud infrastructure, and national cyber resilience. So today we're going to unpack the real challenges of building sovereign technology in a globalised ecosystem, with especially the big disruptions we're seeing across the trade world at the moment, what implications that might have for AUKUS Pillar Two. And we're not talking about submarines, we're talking about the technological partnerships across our AUKUS partners, and what government and enterprises need to understand about deploying classified cloud infrastructure in a zero-trust world. We'll also touch on Vault Cloud's investment, $22.5 million from the government. Is this starting to signal a shift in how Australia is beginning to back its own national cybersecurity tech sector? I think that'll be a good part of the conversation. So thank you for always joining me, Jason Murrell, my co-host. Thank you for joining us, Rupert. And over to you, Jason, for the first question.
Thank you, mate. That was that was a long intro. Now, Rupert, you have been at the forefront of the sovereign capability. It's been Tom and I have watched your journey pretty much along the whole way. So, just for the listeners who don't know, and we will get into more of the detail with regard to the government and your involvement there. But can you just give us an entry point on how you actually ended up starting Vault Cloud and sort of what you did before that? So the journey into it, because I think that'll be of a lot of interest to people listening as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Tom, for having me. So today, Vault Cloud is by far the dominant domestic provider. We're Australia's national hyperscale cloud here in Australia. And it started a very long time ago. I used to be the founder and CEO of another software company that was in the government space, but not in the sort of more sensitive national security space. And so we started off life as a hybrid organization. We had some on-premise servers, but we needed to do this massive batch processing. And so we used to ship all that off to AWS, to Amazon. And this is sort of 15 years ago now, probably a little bit more, maybe coming up to 20. And so that was quite common today, but quite novel at the time in terms of what we were doing. And then what we found was government was our customer, and they had deep concerns over the security and the location and the management of Australian citizens' data within that system. And they essentially told us, stop using the cloud. Like the cloud's not secure, you can't send stuff to the cloud, you need to bring it back on premise. And so if you think about that company, it was a software company, not a cloud company. We really didn't want to be in the infrastructure game. So that forced us to beef up what we had on premise and grow it. And that was very much a typical sort of VMware, Cisco, NetApp sort of legacy on-premise stack. And what we went through the next part of the journey, still on the civilian side, was this need to constantly comply to the evolving threat cybersecurity landscape and apply additional security controls. Now, we didn't own the intellectual property that we were running on. We used to buy the system and run it. We didn't really own the IP. And so these requests would come through, and more we were having to tell the government, no, sorry, we can't comply to this. No, sorry, we can't comply to that. So we ultimately made what seemed like a not massive decision at the time, but turned out to be pretty big, which was we spun off a company that was a joint venture with a number of others to then build communal infrastructure. And we weren't using the word cloud as much back then, but communal infrastructure for the government supplier base to then host these systems on. And we made what was a very critical decision, was that we wanted to own the source code of this platform. So we weren't buying other people's stuff in. And so that sort of takes you up to 2012, so 13 years ago. About 2 years into that journey, the Australian Signals Directorate started to take a bigger role in the security of our national infrastructure, and particularly in the cloud space. So you had the Australian Signals Directorate, which was not a mature cloud consumer, didn't really understand cloud, and you had Vault, which whilst focusing on security, it was the lower classifications of security and didn't really know much about secret and top secret. So you can kind of see the match there. We could teach them a lot about cloud. They could teach us a lot about nation state actors and threats and architecture and the vulnerabilities and breaches that government had previously, and we could then learn that information from them, which wasn't available in the public arena, incorporate that into our business. Now, so there were two big decisions. One was we wanted to own IP. That was a big one. And then we made the decision to build the top secret security controls at the source code level natively into our product. And again, looking back, these turned out to be very big decisions that at the time were taken reasonably lightly. And then we went on this massively long journey to re-engineer this platform from almost the dawn of the organization to include the top secret security controls for the Australian government. So that's the Protective Security Policy Framework, the Defence Security Policy Framework, and the Information Security Manual. Essential 8, top 4, blah, 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 and all of those things. So really like a natively homegrown solution to that problem. And that's kind of the early years of how we got into this space.
Yeah, because you did see things beforehand. That was what I always liked about any meeting I had with you is the foresight that you were looking forward on the horizon about what was coming up or what needed to happen. Was that a mixture of obviously your foresight, but also the conversations you were having with government, where they were going, or what was the blend there? Because I always found with what you were doing with Vault Cloud, you always seem to have your finger on the pulse, or always were just that little, that one step ahead of where you need to be, which is key in the industry and something that not a lot of people do. Was that a mixture of both, or sort of how did you come
I'll take
about
a
with
little bit of credit for that, but if
that? No, take as much as you want, mate. Take as much as you want, though. That's it. Take it all.
truth be told, we were solving our own problems.
Yep.
We weren't sat there going, I wonder who someone else's problem is and what they need. We
Mm.
had our own software and systems and processes and companies and partners that needed to secure at that time, back in sort of 2013, 2014, social security records, health records, like very sensitive citizen information, but not national security information. And the government's concerns around how we were treating that data was very real. And so it was really born out of necessity. We were feeding ourselves in terms of the product and the platform we were building. And that meant we weren't designing something for someone someday, maybe. It was designing something for an immediate problem we ourselves were experiencing. And I think that just meant that it was a very, I don't want to use the word user-centric because it's actually very security-centric, which is often not user-centric.
Mm.
But from a security user, it was a user-centric built platform, and we were solving our own problems.
Yeah, and you kept that balance pretty good. That was the thing too, because often Tom and I, when we're doing these podcasts, and why we love having someone like yourself on there is to dig a bit deeper into the psychology of how these things happen. Because often the mistake we make in Australia, and we talk about this all the time, is that we don't build it customer or user centric. And as you said, it was sort of a byproduct of what you were doing, but the case is, and the case in point of what you've done, and the reason why you've been successful in getting to the point you have done is because I think mainly because that key point that the user, and you're protecting the user as well. That's another key thing. In cyber, it's often making data too easily accessible. The way you've been able to build that vault around this has been a key aspect to it. How do you keep that balance between the usability of it and the protection of it? Because that's also with data, the trick, isn't it, is how do you give it accessibility to the right people, but not to the wrong people, and not make it overly onerous to try and get that two-way sort of situation happening? How have you managed to balance that, or what was your main trick there?
Yeah, it's very hard, and obviously sometimes there are compromises to be made. Sometimes you don't deliver all things to all people, and I think that's kind of what differentiates us from some of the public clouds is we don't try and service some of those markets, and we are security focused. In the earlier days, a lot of the challenges we had were if you start applying very heavy grade encryption or data management processes to things, it uses a lot of resources. So we were sort of fighting the security side. That was sort of design principle number one. If there was a compromise to be made, it's the other thing that suffered. It wasn't security. But then when we started to build that out, maintaining the performance of the platform with all of that embedded security was quite a challenge. There was quite a lot of engineering effort that was required for that. And then the next phase of problems that came was the scaling up phase. So the sort of the hyperscale model and the scaling up phase. So to achieve security, performance, and scale all at the same time is quite hard. And then, as you said, there's a usability layer on top of that. And to sort of give you a bit of an idea of, to use our own brand name on how we think of this, is we don't claim to make the best of everything. There are better companies out there for some use cases, but we try and be the best we are in the use case we're in. And the analogy we always use is your home door. A vault door and your home door are just not the same things. We build vault doors in the physical analogy, and other people would build much better front doors for your house than us. Our doors are heavy, they're bulletproof, they're slow, but they ultimately provide very high security. And so I think that sometimes people go into the security market going, is it high security or low security? Is it better or worse? The truth is that there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of nuance in the product that has to be built into that. And it's, you need to look at what you're protecting. Protecting a top secret national security system or a secret national security system is very different to protecting a startup or someone or a government department that hosts a bus timetable that's public information.
Yeah, no, I think you've got that balance well. Sorry, Tom, I'll let you go. But that's something, as I said, in all the conversation I had and admired from, looking at it from the outside in, that's the key thing. And I think that's the skill that you have managed to balance out, is that real tricky line of actually where you sit. And I think, the vault analogy, I love that too. I love that you're actually able to distill it in that sort of sense. This is something that
and the bit where
Tom
you
and I
sort of
love.
said on foresight, the bit I think where we probably in recent times were a little bit ahead of the curve is there was a lot of discussion pre-COVID around the security tension with some of our regional neighbours and the trading relationship with some of our regional neighbours. And so there's a lot of discussion on what way we should go as a country and how we should resolve that. And the answer to us was always very simple, that no matter who your partners are, you want to, if you want to add value to your partners, like an AUKUS or a Five Eyes partnership, the more technology and capability and sovereign capability you've got, the more you've got to offer those partners. And if you need to be independent of those partners for some reason, the more sovereign capability you've got, the better as well. So we were really heavily focused on that sovereign capability piece, really from sort of 2015 onwards. And as you'd know, sort of COVID was the trigger point that kind of shocked people into realizing the reality around some of that. And then we've just seen that sort of grow. So with all the sort of the political tensions and trade and all those sorts of things, we've just seen that go through the roof in recent months. And having sovereign capability, I think there's almost no one that these days doesn't think that any country shouldn't have some sovereign capability at the moment.
How much of this inconvenience do you think needs to kind of like permeate through our wider culture with things like access to super, access to tax, access to other areas where there is real risk rather than just losing an order or getting spammed or something like that? How much of these other organizations should actually be looking at inconveniencing people a little bit on the journey to give them a vault door that they know the bad actors can't get through?
Yeah, and so I mean, just to put it in context on how Vault works in that space, so we would see public cloud providers as kind of low to medium security, and Vault being sort of medium to high security. And there is a little bit of overlap in our market segments, but not a lot. The challenge is, so like for instance, in Vault's platform, you can't turn on or off MFA. It's not a choice. There's just no setting. It's built in. It comes there. We don't have a use case for it to be turned off. Now, if a public cloud provider were to force everyone to do that, they would have an attrition of customers, is the sad truth. That people would go to the lower security platform that was easier to use. And we see this even in our platform. We have a lot of customers that come on that are in a reasonably secure area of the economy. And they'll say, look, how do we turn all these security controls off just while we build it? And then we'll turn them all on once we build it and once it's in production. And we would say, well, how do you know that it wasn't compromised on the journey to building it? And these are inconvenient questions for people. And so even in our space, with our customer base, we even see that where we get requests and our operations team obviously have to say, there's no controllable switch or toggle to turn some of these things off. And so we sort of impose that high level of security. Now, in our case, we would argue that your ability to sort of get accredited by government and get things moving is overall easier, even if the security components were a little bit imposed on you. And we sort of don't apologize for that. And the great thing that we've got is we can go back to government documents like the ISM and others and say, well, here's the security control we're enforcing. We didn't do this to annoy you. It's an actual requirement that we have to do for you. In terms of the broader economy, I mean, I'm doing a lot of work in artificial intelligence at the moment. We have an artificial intelligence capability within our platform, but we're looking at more broader things as well. The artificial intelligence side is moving so quickly. There are companies that have 2,000 to 3,000 people that are worth more than $1 billion that are 18 months old, right? Like this is crazy value creation in that space. And then when you go and meet their staff and you start asking some very basic security questions, it's clear that out of those 2,000 people, no one looks after security. It's not even a design principle. And their argument is somewhat rational, which is we just needed to be 1 week ahead of our competitors when we launched our product. And then we got all the press and the media and the excitement. And to be honest, adding security, that probably would have delayed us by 6 months, not a week, in terms of getting there. So you've got these incentive models where people are actually choosing not to do that. I think in some of the examples you gave, people probably regret their decisions. They probably, if they could replay things, they probably would turn on some security features and secure their customers' data and their systems. But in some cases, we're seeing, particularly in artificial intelligence, people they're choosing not to do it. They're just like, I don't have time, budget, or resource to actually make that investment. And that's one of the reasons we're looking in the artificial intelligence space. We think we can offer that nexus of security and artificial intelligence, which is hard because it's a very emerging area. But yeah, I mean, I agree. There's consequences to those decisions. I think one of the challenges is more often than not, the citizens whose data is compromised did not get to make any of those decisions. They saw a brand they recognized, they trusted that brand. There is not a lot of regulation in this space. Like if you sort of think of it as an analogy to crime, where there's some rules of the road, and you've got sort of traffic cues and things that you see, and then there's a car. If it hits someone, there's an ambulance to respond. The police come and investigate. You can be prosecuted. The truth is, in a lot of these situations, you can be quite alone when these incidents occur. And there's a lot you as an organization could have done to prevent these things. But it's often after the fact that you find out these things. And if you think of over the history of time, cybersecurity is quite a new concept. And there's still a maturity curve for a lot of organizations to go through. And it has to be balanced out with financial and functional factors that those organizations have to choose. And of course, we're seeing many times that unfortunately people make that calculus incorrectly. And it's all risk based, right? Like even Volt's never had a customer breach of its system, which is statistically a big aberration compared to our competitors. But I am in no
touch some wood, Rupert.
Yeah,
saying that sort of thing.
No illusion that could happen to us. Like we've probably got what we do have, because it's independently assessed, some of the most secure systems in existence on the planet. But that by no means that they are flawless or impenetrable. They're just the best that there is. And if you have a very, very motivated state actor that's essentially got unlimited financial resources, unlimited human capital, and people fighting for the existence of their country, or at least certainly in their own minds, these are very formidable adversaries that are very capable of stretching any organization to the limits of its security.
Well, let's do a little pivot now onto a very confusing subject for a lot of people, AUKUS. And within AUKUS, we've got the submarine conversation, which dominates and is stuck in most people's brains. But then there's AUKUS Pillar Two. And the first time I kind of did a dive into that really was about 2 years ago with a company called Chaos One at UTS Tech Labs in Sydney, that were two ex-commando officers that are basically bringing together different solutions from Australia, UK, and the US, and smashing them together to do some real tight turnaround. Some of these things were on the battlefield in Ukraine months after their October Sky program. But just for the listeners, first of all, just tell us a little bit more about AUKUS 2 and what you're kind of doing and where you see the opportunities for Australia within that program, if it manages to keep its legs up.
Yeah. So firstly, I'd say I don't have to explain what AUKUS is very often in Australia, but I spend a lot of time in the UK and the US, and 9 out of 10 times I actually have to explain what AUKUS is. So I'm pretty well rehearsed at explaining this. So for the viewers that don't know, AUKUS is a trilateral arrangement between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. It's a military arrangement primarily, and people get confused with Five Eyes. They think, isn't that just the Five Eyes without two of them? Well, so the Five Eyes is an intelligence arrangement. So that's including also Canada and New Zealand, where there's information and sharing intelligence. One way to think of that is the Five Eyes predominantly happens at the top secret layer in terms of intelligence sharing, and AUKUS predominantly happens at secret and below, right? So it's more of a military engagement than an intelligence engagement. And so AUKUS is then broken down into two areas. One is the submarines, which is an incredibly complex ambition that we've got. I think it's hard enough for a country to build a submarine program, but to try and build an intercontinental submarine program is genuinely ambitious. I'm sort of, in various ways involved in conversations regularly on that. And then on the Pillar Two side, it's around technology. So, in our area, cybersecurity and AI, but then you've also got hypersonics and other things that are outside of our area that are in there. And so, from my perspective, Pillar One is very here and now and real. There are things that are needed and things that need to be produced and things that need to be done. It's obviously a very long multi-decade program, but there are things that need delivering today. And then Pillar Two is my personal opinion is kind of secondary to Pillar One, but it's about putting in then a way to transfer information and knowledge and essentially contribute to a military industrial base, both with the government's involvement and the private sector's involvement to bring things together. And some of the key things that have happened around that is like the restriction on export controls like ITAR, where they've created a license-free environment where there's, even at the commercial level, if you think it's quite hard, if I have some intellectual property and another company wants to use it, but I don't have a commercial incentive to do that, it's very hard to actually transfer intellectual property between non-financial arrangement organizations. That's hard enough. But with a lot of the export controls around military stuff, you're actually prohibited from sharing it. So it's even if you find a commercial way to share that information, you're prohibited in many cases from doing so. So it's essentially lowering the barriers around that so that there can be more collaboration between those three countries and their industrial bases.
And where are you seeing the kind of exciting opportunities for, Australia's contribution into that Pillar Two?
So I mean, for Pillar Two, I think one of the contexts is it's quite a feat to get a government agency in alignment with itself. It's quite a feat to get three countries to be in alignment, and then to put an industrial base that then sits behind that is quite challenging as well. So I think what I'm seeing is sort of two streams. The governments are trying to get themselves collected and together and have a clear program and schedule of works. And it's a very long-term project, and we're in the early stages of that. And then you've got industry, which in some cases is very specifically building products and services that are for AUKUS. And then you've also got people that are sort of just moving their marketing material towards AUKUS because of the dollars that are associated around that. Like my personal view is once you add up the expenditure of all three countries, you're talking about more than $1 trillion of total expenditure, which is an enormous market to play into. That's Pillar One and Pillar Two together. So it is pretty broad. I mean, there is a list, of course, of things, as I said, like hypersonic, cybersecurity, and AI. But yeah, there's an opportunity to, for instance, take the training data from sensory information from all of the three countries, combine that data, blend it into AI models to then take those AI models, give them back to the countries, and then explore. Utilize those models in a way that would be more effective than, say, that one country could have done alone because the training data was smaller. But there's just a lot, and the industrial base to move around that will take a lot of time. One of the challenges with that is the communication and interoperability. So you've got government-to-government interoperability, you've got industry-to-industry interoperability. We're talking about very sensitive systems, so you can't just chuck these things in sort of an M365 account or a Dropbox and ship them across over the ocean to someone else. These are sort of highly secure, highly sensitive systems, and so there needs to be the infrastructure in place, both from a telecommunications and a cloud hosting and a security perspective and accreditations and authority to operate that then brings all that together so that those nations and industry can interoperate. And that's a substantial challenge that will take a few more years to roll out, in my opinion.
Mm. And the money recently that you received from the government, can you just talk to that and how that sort of came about? Because often these are long processes you go through if it's some form of grant or some sort of allocation of funds from the government, and what the sort of stories behind that, what you need to do now, sort of going forward to meet the requirements for that allocation.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'll talk about what the challenge was. So this goes way beyond pre-AUKUS. This is a
Mm,
longer term challenge for our business. We want to be a sovereign provider to Australia. The Australian capital markets are um, reasonably small on a global basis, and so the available capital to us is more limited than we would like it to be. I guess everyone's capital is probably more limited to them than they'd like it to be,
mm,
but it was more acute in our space because of our customer base.
yep.
There's areas I can't go into, but our customer base has very specific views around the ownership and control of our organization that would go beyond most organizations. And just to put a finer point on that, if you have something built and shipped to you, you probably care about your supply chain. But if you have something built that is then operated by that company, like a cloud, as in there's a sustainment piece to that, where those core systems are run, your sensitivity goes to a 10 out of 10. Because
Mm,
if you turn those systems off, the underlying national security of the country is turned off at the same time as that system is turned off. So the
yep.
sensitivity really couldn't be higher in terms of our shareholder base and what we do. And so we've had that challenge for a long time. And so we've been talking to government around that for a long time. And then at a certain point, the National Reconstruction Fund was formed as part of the commitment under the Labor government. And then as part of that $15 billion of funding that was made available, there was about $500 million that was set aside for defence and national security. Um, the arrangements between the National Reconstruction Fund and the Department of Defence is probably not something for me to talk about, but there is obviously some arrangements in place there. And so as a result of that, we then had the National Reconstruction Fund look at what we wanted to do and what we wanted to invest in. And so then we put that forward to them. That was obviously ultimately successful. It was a long process. It was
Mm,
I think from start to finish, it was about 9 months. But that
yeah.
was in the
Wow.
context of a lot of activity before that 9 months started as well. It's pretty exciting for us because to have a investment instrument directly into our business from the government. If you think about the word sovereignty, you probably don't get more sovereign than the
Mm,
government itself having that economic interest in our outcome. And so it's really sort of helped bond the trust between us and our customer base, which is predominantly the government. And then so one of the uses of funds that we put forward under that was to build an AUKUS cloud capability. Now, cloud regions, as you know, would be very expensive. They're hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars to build, and so it was part of a larger funding round. But the 22.5 that the government funded towards, part of that was for that preliminary work on the AUKUS environment. And so what we're looking at there, that's publicly disclosable, is looking obviously at the Australian requirements, which we already comply to, so that one was sort of done already. Then there's a number of requirements for something called an authority to operate in the US. So this is like zero trust and NIST and other things like
mm,
that. And then in the UK, there's another set of standards as well. And so one of the reasons I'm traveling so much at the moment to the UK and the US is to try and harmonize that. And to give you again back to the vault door analogy, if the Australian government says you need to use an Australian buy lock, and then the US government says you need to use a combination lock, and then the UK government says you need to use a fingerprint for your vault door, how do you do all of those at the same time? In the physical world, you can kind of just layer all three. In the logical world, inside the cloud, sometimes you have to make trade offs. And so there's quite a deep engineering piece of work that needs to be done to simultaneously comply to those three requirements. And of course, that then leaves us with the opportunity to sort of springboard into the broader markets in those countries outside of AUKUS as well. But so that's the engineering work we're trying to do at the moment, which is how do we make it such that each of the AUKUS countries can trust the platform and where they're sending their data simultaneously. And that is a genuinely substantial engineering feat that our organization has embarked upon.
Yeah, well, it sounds like 22 and a half might not be enough. You might need to get
Barely
some more,
scratched the
mate. Wow.
I understand it's called Secret Cloud, and it's basically all about managing that classified data. And in order to kind of educate people across the broader spectrum and give them an understanding of it, it's kind of funny because I don't feel like any of these platforms should allow you to switch 2FA off. It should just literally be a cultural standard. But if you're in, you're in finance, handling people's kind of money, you're your lawyers and people like that holding a whole bunch of information. I mean, is the secret cloud space something that you should be thinking about getting into, or is it really just the domain for the nation states and the kind of big government tools and apparatuses we need to keep our critical infrastructure protected?
I have mixed views on the answer to that. So I'd say when we go and meet a lot of commercial organizations, bearing in mind we're a very government-focused supplier, but particularly sort of larger banks and things like that, in their mind, there is nothing more sensitive in the world than the data that they hold, right? That's the mindset that they have. If you're speaking to people from the CISO team or something like that, it's probably different views in other places. And then so they sort of automatically gravitate towards, we need your top secret capability for our organization. And then we sort of start to explain the reality of that, which is substantial. And so I think that if you're protecting a system that if it's compromised, it can be terminal for a nation, that is different than if it is terminal for a bank and causes a whole bunch of harm for banking customers. And so some of the other systems we hold systems that have safety critical systems that if they go down, there could be a loss of life impact to that. We have systems where we're holding, one of my earlier companies, one of the early use cases was social security records. And so if you imagine if you had a difficult childhood and you suffered some form of sort of egregious abuse, and you went and saw a psychologist and documented that, and all of the things that happened in your childhood are then written down, they have to go and be stored in a system somewhere. And if that information was to be released and become publicly disclosed through a breach, there is a proportion of people that unfortunately may choose to take their lives in the knowledge that information was out there and couldn't face that. And so I don't want to just sort of say, look, there's nation state stuff at the top and then there's other stuff down the bottom. There's obviously some use cases where you've got health data and psychological assessments and things like that really is at the, it's not at the national security level, it's very, very close. And so I think you've got to think through what's the consequences of the exposure of that data, and then what's the appropriate security controls around that. So I'll give you a very simple example. In the secret environment, without disclosing anything that's sensitive, you could, it's not on the internet. You need to go to a secure location and a secure building, and there's specific infrastructure that sits between you and other bits of infrastructure there. If you told a banking user that's going, put your phone down, sorry, you need to go to a secure location in order to see your bank balance, that's clearly not an appropriate security control for a bank. So as I said, I think there is a nuance in there. I think some of the controls that we have in place, particularly in like our critical infrastructure cloud environment, are probably good. Like when someone's had a breach, they often come to us after, and they wish they'd come to us earlier. And that's in sort of the official sensitive or protected security domains that we offer. But once you start getting up to secret and top secret, the burden and impost of the security controls in that environment are pretty extreme. Like we don't, for instance, when we go into some of our facilities, we don't have any metal on us, right? There's no smartwatches. We take our belts off. So that's not appropriate for a banking customer to go through. So there is a gradient.
But where is that? Where is that appropriate though, Rube? Because I think we do understand your your customers currently, but in the go forward position, if there are people that want to go up the chain and sort of get into your sort of system, where do you feel the cutoff point is, or who do you think it is suitable for? Some people that might not have thought of it. I mean, we have talked about banking customers, but there are some banking customers that would be very open to having that extra level of protection, or having the level of security and surrounds. Who do you take on, or who don't you? What's your sort of cutoff point, and sort of go forward, or looking forward in a position? How could someone become a customer of you, or who are you still looking for as a customer that's probably your ideal customer?
Yeah, so we have what we call our target market, and we have what we
Mm.
call our accepted market. So our
Yep.
target market is very, very narrow. It's government, including national security and defense supply chain. And then on the critical infrastructure side, it's public safety organizations. So like air services is a good example of someone that would fit
Yep.
into that category. And then people that provide critical services to citizens. So that's, again, not necessarily government, but more in the government
Mm.
space. In terms of who we accept into the higher classification clouds, we don't even really control that, to be honest. That's a matter between us and some of the regulatory authorities that operate in that space. When you get into the lower environments, we have government cloud and critical infrastructure cloud. Critical infrastructure clouds are lowest one, so that goes up to protected. So it's
Mm-hmm.
official sensitive to protected. The people
Yep.
that are eligible for that is anyone on the Home Affairs critical infrastructure list. So that's
Okay.
essentially then sort of the lowest we go to. So the government's deemed that some organization, which sometimes can be may not be obvious to people, water companies, logistics companies, there are things that are just needed for the country to operate.
Mm.
If you can have a loss of life consequence to your system failing, or a series of your competitors in your systems failing, that's kind of where we like to play into. It's obviously very tempting to kind of go down more into the commercial space for us, but it's very hard to do the home front door and the vault front door at the same time. And,
Yep.
and and there is just a reality that not everyone wants the vault door.
Yeah, good to have that reference point, because I think it's good to know, because Tom did ask me before you came on. He did say he was wondering if he qualified for it, but it just sounds he's missed the Sockiac, so he just misses the cutoff for that. So he is critical to us, but I just don't think to the nation just yet. So
I was just thinking your social security analogy, the New South Wales law courts, losing all that information, that fits right in that kind of thing.
Yeah, when
Someone
you think
might take a
domestic
horrible
violence and
action.
everything, yeah, it's
Yeah, I hope they give
something
you
that
a call.
yeah,
Yeah,
well,
well, I mean, I've testified in front of more than one parliamentary committee on some of that stuff, and yeah, I mean, you can look at my public comments on the record, but yeah, some of the security, I think that there's just an onus in government to achieve a higher standard than a commercial organisation. I think when citizens hand their data over to government, they do not expect it to go to a foreign company. They do not expect it to go offshore. They do not expect it to have best effort security controls. They expect it to be highly secure. They expect it to be regulated, and too often there are government agencies that, whilst having all those standards and things they have to achieve, ultimately, I mean, ANAO publishes many reports on this. Unfortunately, many government agencies do not achieve their own security standards today.
I'd love just to wrap it up, not necessarily in a doom and gloom way, but what are you seeing as the big risks that are approaching us? Because, I mean, one of the things that we're watching in the
You love a
last
doom and gloom wrap up, Tommy. Come on, don't be
couple of
like that.
months, yeah.
I don't want to
Well,
have a
it's
doom
good.
and gloom, Rupert. But give us doom and gloom, mate. Just give it to us.
We've seen kind of like, especially with the shift in with tariffs, or people are moving trade routes, which is going to impact, all the supply chains and all of that changing around. I mean, it just seems to me like it's a massive opportunity for the bad actors out there.
It is chaos out there, but I'm definitely a glass half full person on this one. I think every time you're seeing these changes, it's probably on average bad for an incumbent. And if you're a challenger entering a market, it generally creates opportunity. And to give you some specific examples of that, if we go back to artificial intelligence, there's something called the AI diffusion framework, which essentially restricts the exports of chips, AI chips. So originally that was targeted at China for reasonably obvious reasons by the US. But then they've expanded that to over 100 countries now. So in terms of tier one countries, there's only 18 countries in the world that are allowed unlimited access to the highest performance AI systems and chips in the world, and Australia is one of those. So you've now suddenly got a country that has unfettered access to the world's best technology, at the same time that our regional neighbours have now been restricted to have access. So when you couldn't sell your mother to get one of these chips before, now all of a sudden they're available to us because there's limited supply constraints. when you start to look at the tariff changes as well, it does start to shift trade flows. It does create opportunities in some areas and others. Painfully, I go to the US a lot, and whenever I tap my credit card with the current exchange rate, I sort of wince every time I see the conversion. But then as an exporter, our ability to export in the US, we're able to just simply meet a price point that American companies can't. And then we're not subject to tariffs in Australia from the US, but our competitors, their own governments, put tariffs on the American companies that we're competing against. And so suddenly we're seeing that cost input base go up and ours is not. And in fact, arguably, it's gone down a little because it's had a supply demand impact as well, right? So now there's a little less demand, so there's a little bit more relative supply, which means we can get cheaper products and services. Plus, we're then exporting on a weaker Australian dollar, which means we can export more. For every negative, I, especially in the US, I feel like I have to sort of put 10 minutes aside at the beginning of every conversation to listen to what happened today from people and how it's massively impacted what they're doing. Like, government people in the US can't have flights. So, someone that was going to come and fly and see me now can't come and fly and see me and things like that. But I think that every time something like that happens, there's also an opportunity on the other side. And I think Australian companies are typically smaller than US companies. And so that means that on average, I think it's good for Australia in some ways because we're the more agile companies that can take advantage of some of these geopolitical shifts that we're seeing.
Yeah, fantastic. Jason, anything you want to add?
No, it's probably not doom and gloom enough for Tom. Do you want to maybe have another crack at that, Rupert, and go with the glass half empty? Because that's probably wouldn't appease Tom. He's not going to be able to pull it.
Look, I do love a glass half full, to be honest with you. It's just, it is again one of these conversations, even with that CrowdStrike update that went wrong, people still have in their heads out there in the public that the internet is a fallible thing. And it is easily damageable, and the kind of risk of changing our lives, especially now that we live on digital currencies with our phones and hardly anyone carries cash anymore. Lots and lots of challenges out there. I just want to say thank you so much, Rupert, for joining us. It's been a great conversation. It's been really good to dive into the kind of protection our government is actually seeking. A bit more of an understanding about AUKUS Pillar Two, which is fantastic, I think, because it gets swamped in the conversation. And listeners, please follow Rupert Taylor-Price on LinkedIn. Check out Vault Cloud. There's lots of great information. And just, maybe if you are in that kind of spot where you've decided that 2FA should be an option on your platform, maybe remove that, deal with the friction. I think it sets a lovely piece of culture. So thank you, Rupert, for joining us. Thank you, Jason, as always, for being my co-host.
Thank you very much for having me.